The parking lot was quiet except for the sound of engines dying one by one. 15 of them. Big chrome-heavy road-worn Harleys cutting out in a loose formation across the cracked asphalt of Garrett Holt's gas station on Route 9. The last engine turned over twice, coughed, and went silent. And in that silence, standing at the edge of the lot with nothing but cracked pavement under her bare feet, was a girl nobody in Grayville, Georgia, could quite bring themselves to see. She was 19 years old. Her hair was tangled from sleeping outside. Her jacket had a torn left sleeve and a pocket that no longer closed. Her feet were black with road dust, the soles hardened from months of pavement and gravel and cold concrete. She had no phone, no wallet, no one waiting for her anywhere on earth. She had run 2 miles at dawn on an empty stomach to reach this parking lot. And not one of the 15 men climbing off their bikes believed a word she said. The engine stayed off. The riders moved toward the pump, stretching their backs, cracking their knuckles, laughing about something one of them had said 3 miles back. They were loud in the easy way men get loud when they feel safe, when the road has been good and the destination is close enough to feel real. Nobody looked at the girl standing at the edge of the lot. Nobody except one man standing at the back of the formation who had gone very still. The girl dropped to her knees. Not for effect, not as performance. Her knees just gave the way knees give when a person has nothing left to spend. She pressed her palms flat against the asphalt and stared at the ground, and her lips moved in something that wasn't quite words. It was the shape of a prayer, the rhythm of one learned from a woman who had believed fiercely that the right words said quietly were worth more than any amount of shouting. The man at the back of the formation watched her for 3 seconds. Then he walked forward past 14 men who weren't paying attention and stopped 6 feet away from her. He looked at her the way you look at someone you are actually seeing. What happened in the next 6 days changed Grayville, Georgia in ways the town is still measuring. But to understand any of it, you have to go back 14 months. You have to go back to a narrow clapboard house on Birch Lane with a leaking roof and a porch swing that announced itself every time the wind moved through it. You have to go back to the smell of cinnamon and something floral lavender, maybe drifting from a kitchen where an old woman was always either cooking or pretending to. And you have to understand what it meant for a girl named Nora Callum to lose the only world she had ever known. Ruth Callum was 73 years old when she died. She had raised Nora from the time Nora was 3 after Nora's mother walked out one Thursday morning and kept walking. Nora's father was a name on a document Ruth had never shown her. There was no extended family to speak of, no cousins who called on holidays, no aunts who sent cards with $5 tucked inside. There was Ruth and there was Nora and there was the house on Birch Lane. And that was the entire shape of their world. And for a long time, it was enough. Ruth had a way of making small things feel significant. She kept a chipped blue mug on the windowsill that she said had belonged to her own grandmother, though the story changed slightly every time she told it. She grew tomatoes in coffee cans on the back porch because she said store-bought ones tasted like cardboard and disappointment. On Sunday evenings, she made biscuits from scratch, the kind that took longer than any reasonable person would spend on biscuits, and she'd hum while she worked. Old hymns, mostly sometimes songs Nora didn't recognize that Ruth claimed she'd made up herself. She read every night. That was the thing Nora held on to later. The detail that kept surfacing when she was trying to sleep under a bridge with rain tapping against corrugated tin. Ruth read every single night, even when her eyes were going, and the print and library books had to be held at arm's length to make sense. She read historical fiction and true crime, and occasionally romances she'd check out under a fake name she'd made up for the library card, a name she'd never told anyone. She and Nora read side by side on the couch for years, comfortable in the kind of silence that doesn't feel like silence at all. When Nora was 12, she started reading faster than Ruth. She'd finish her book and slide over and read the last third of whatever Ruth was working on while Ruth was still in the middle. Ruth pretended to be annoyed. She was not annoyed. She was proud in the way people are proud when someone they love exceeds them at something they care about, the kind of pride that doesn't need to announce itself, because it lives in the face whether you want it to or not. They had a ritual for Sunday evenings that never varied. Ruth would start the biscuits after the evening news. Nora would set the table without being asked. They'd eat together at the kitchen table with the radio on low, and afterward they'd move to the couch and read until one of them fell asleep, which was almost always Ruth sinking into her corner cushion, with her book tilted at an angle that made the reading increasingly theoretical. Nora would take the book, fold the corner of the page to mark Ruth's place, set it on the side table and pull the blue Afghan from the back of the couch and lay it over her grandmother's legs. Then she'd keep reading in the lamplight while Ruth slept, and the house would be quiet around them in the way that only houses with two people who trust each other completely can be quiet. That was the world. It was small and it was sufficient, and Nora did not understand until it was gone how much of her sense of safety lived inside it. Nora dropped out of school in 11th grade 3 weeks after Ruth was admitted to Colton Regional Hospital with a pneumonia that the admitting physician described as severe. The doctor said she needed intravenous antibiotics and monitoring and at least 2 weeks of inpatient care. Ruth said she couldn't afford 2 weeks of inpatient care. The doctor said the alternative was worse. Ruth said she understood, but she'd take her chances. The doctor said that was not an option he could support. They went back and forth like this for 20 minutes while Nora sat in a plastic chair in the hallway and stared at the linoleum and understood that the conversation she was overhearing was about whether her grandmother was going to live. She didn't drop out because she stopped caring about school. She dropped out because with Ruth in the hospital, there was no one to handle anything and everything needed handling. Bills, phone calls, the mortgage payment that had been late 3 months running, the slow discovery that Ruth had been stretching every dollar so thin for so long that there was almost nothing left underneath. Nora spent 3 weeks learning the shape of a financial situation she had never been allowed to see, understanding that the comfortable smallness of their life had been held together by a woman who never let on how hard the holding was. Every bill Nora opened, every past due notice she unfolded at the kitchen table was a kind of retroactive revelation. Ruth had been managing a quiet emergency for years. She had managed it so well that Nora had never known. Ruth died on a Tuesday morning in November just after 7 o'clock. Nora was sitting beside the bed with Ruth's hand in both of hers. The monitor made it sound. A nurse came in and said something in a soft voice, and then gently, firmly helped Nora's fingers let go one by one. Nora sat in the plastic chair beside the empty bed for a long time after. She was not sure how long. Time moved differently in that room once the sound stopped. The bank sent a notice 60 days later. The mortgage had been delinquent for longer than Nora had understood. There were fees attached to fees, and a process that had apparently been underway for some time, and the outcome was not something Nora had the resources to contest. A man in a gray suit arrived on a Wednesday morning in January and changed the locks on 412 Birch Lane, while Nora stood on the sidewalk with a single duffel bag and watched him work. He had a clipboard and a systematic efficiency about him. He tried the new key twice to confirm it worked. He did not look at her once. She tried the shelter in Colton, 20 miles south. Full. She was put on a list she was told could take 4 to 6 weeks to move her. She tried a church on 5th Street in Grayville whose sign read, "All are welcome," in large, cheerful letters. Pastor Wendell Lewis met her in the foyer with his hands folded and his voice carefully warm and told her he would pray for her situation. She thanked him. She left. She thought about what it meant that a building advertising universal welcome had nothing to offer except words, and she stored that thought in the place where she kept things she couldn't do anything about. She found the bridge on her third night without a roof. The Millbrook Bridge was not a bridge anyone paid much attention to. It had been built in the early 1960s, a 2-lane steel girder structure over Miller Creek, about a quarter-mile south of town on Route 9. It had been made partially redundant by a highway bypass put in during the 1980s, and now it carried mostly local traffic, farm trucks, and the occasional county vehicle, and people who didn't want to bother with the longer route. It was old and rust-streaked and unremarkable, the kind of infrastructure that exists in the background of a place without anyone thinking much about it. Underneath the eastern embankment, where the concrete footing met the slope of the bank, there was a shallow alcove, wide enough for a sleeping bag, deep enough to stay dry if the rain wasn't coming in sideways. Nora dragged a sheet of corrugated tin from a pile behind the closed-down laundromat on Jefferson Street and propped it across the opening to block the wind. She arranged things carefully the way Ruth had arranged the tomato cans on the back porch, with the logic of someone who believes that order matters even when circumstances don't support it. She had a sleeping bag she'd gotten from a donation bin outside the Colton shelter. She had 3 books she'd been carrying since the house. She had a flashlight with batteries that were starting to go. Grayville had roughly 4,000 people. Most of them were aware in a peripheral way that a girl was living under the Millbrook Bridge. This information existed in the town the way a lot of uncomfortable information exists in small towns, acknowledged privately, never addressed publicly, filed under the category of things that are sad, but not anyone's specific responsibility. Vera Pruitt ran the grocery store on Main Street. She was in her early 60s, had worked the store for 30 years, and prided herself on the kind of orderly, well-maintained establishment that reflected well on the town. When Nora came in out of a rainstorm one afternoon in February, soaking wet and shivering, and stood near the canned soup aisle for warmth, Vera came out from behind the counter with a broom. Not to sweep. Nora understood the broom was a message and left before anything was said that would have been hard to take back later. She stood on the sidewalk in the rain and thought about the sign above the door of the church on 5th Street, and she walked back to the bridge. Chief Roy Sutton had been running the Grayville Police Department for 19 years. He was a compact man who carried himself with the authority of someone who had never had that authority seriously challenged. He stopped Nora twice in her first month under the bridge and informed her in the flat, patient tone of someone explaining something to a slow child that loitering near businesses was a citable offense, and that if he had to have this conversation again, there would be consequences. He said it the second time with a hand resting lightly on his belt, the way men rest their hands on their belts when they want you to notice where their hand is. Garrett Holt ran the gas station on Route 9, where the Iron Oath Brotherhood would eventually pull in. He was 26, had grown up in Grayville, and had the comfortable certainty of someone who had never been required to imagine circumstances different from his own. When Nora was around, he looked through her in the way you look through something you've decided isn't worth focusing on. Not malice, erasure, which was its own kind of thing. There was one exception. Abe Weston was 71 years old and ran a one-man auto repair shop at the edge of town on Route 4. He had hands that looked like they'd been worked hard for 50 years because they had been. He didn't say much. He didn't make anything into a production. Every few days, without announcement or expectation of acknowledgement, he left a brown paper bag on the railing of the Millbrook Bridge, a ham sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water, sometimes a granola bar. Once in December, a sleeping bag left folded on the railing with no note attached, just the thing itself in the cold morning. He left these offerings and walked away. If he saw Nora, he nodded. That was all. In January, the bag on the railing contained a flashlight and a folded square of paper. The paper said in handwriting that was careful and slightly cramped, "For your books." That was all it said. No name, no expectation of anything in return. Nora kept the flashlight under her sleeping bag every night. It was the most important thing she owned. She thought about that sometimes, lying in the dark with Miller Creek moving 30 feet below her and the corrugated tin holding out the wind. What it meant that the most important thing you owned was given to you by someone who didn't require you to be anything other than a person who read books. No credentials, no permanent address, no history that reflected well on anyone. Just the fact of writing, which was enough. She read under that bridge most evenings after the light went. She had an arrangement with Mrs. Elaine Patterson, the head librarian at the county library, who let her stay until closing on Tuesdays and Fridays, and never asked questions about the state of her shoes. Nora checked out the maximum allowed and returned them on time without exception, because the library card was one of the few things she still held that connected her to a version of herself that existed before the gray suit and the locks in the sidewalk. She had developed an interest in engineering during her months under the bridge, structural engineering specifically, partly because she lived under a bridge and the bridge was the most constant presence in her life, partly because she had always been drawn to the logic of how things were built, the way weight was distributed, how stress moved through a material, what the difference was between a structure that would hold and one that looked like it would hold but wouldn't. She had read 2 books on the subject in the past 4 months, checking them out under her own name, returning them on time, checking out the next ones on the list. She found comfort in systems that could be understood and principles that held regardless of who applied them. She had been living under the bridge for 11 months when the evening of the 23rd arrived. It was early spring, the kind of night caught between cold and cool, neither committing to either temperature. Nora was sitting with her back against the concrete footing, Abe's flashlight angled at the pages of a library book on load distribution and steel frame construction. She was deep into a chapter about the relationship between beam depth and span capacity when she heard the sound. It was not a sound she could immediately place. A high grinding whine, intermittent at first, coming from somewhere above and to her left. She put the book down. She turned the flashlight off. She sat very still in the dark under the bridge and listened. The grinding came again, longer this time, sustained. She had heard power tools at construction sites, knew that general category of sound, but this was specific. A cutting sound. The kind of sustained mechanical screech that means material is being separated from material in a way that is not meant to be reversed. Under it, she heard voices low and clipped, the kind of voices that are being deliberately kept quiet by people who are aware there is something to keep quiet about. She heard footsteps on the loose gravel of the embankment, more than one set. Nora moved without deciding to move. She shifted right toward the edge of the alcove and pressed herself flat against the concrete footing. The corrugated tin was between her and the outside. Near the top, where it didn't quite meet the underside of the bridge deck, there was a gap maybe 2 inches wide. She raised herself up until she could see through it. 2 men were working on the bridge supports approximately 30 feet from where she lay. They were on the east side of the structure below the deck level, each operating an angle grinder, the kind you could rent from any hardware supply for $40 a day. The sparks from the cutting fell in brief orange showers and died in the mud below the embankment. A third man stood on the bank above them, not working, but directing, with a flashlight in his hand and the stillness of someone overseeing an operation rather than performing it. She knew the third man. Dale Merritt was 48 years old and owned the Iron Mule, the only bar in Grayville that stayed open past 10 on weeknights. He was not someone you didn't recognize in a town of 4,000 people. He was someone Nora had seen at a distance many times. A heavy-set man with gray threading through dark hair. He kept short with an ease about him that came from being someone who expected to be deferred to and generally was. She had seen his truck, a red Dodge Ram, parked behind the police station on evenings when Sutton's cruiser was also there. She had seen them together outside the Iron Mule on at least 6 occasions over the past year, the easy familiarity of men who share a long history and do not need to perform it for each other. She watched Dale Merritt direct 2 men cutting into the support beams of the Millbrook Bridge. She did not move. She watched until the grinding stopped and one of the workers called up to Dale, and Dale replied, and then Dale spoke again, and this time his voice carried clearly across the creek water and the cold spring air without any obstruction. 15 bikes at full speed won't hold past the first 3. Nora pressed herself against the concrete and did not breathe, or breathe so carefully it amounted to the same thing. She stayed flat until the grinding resumed and the sparks fell again, and the 2 men worked their way methodically along the east side one beam and then the next. She counted 4 beams. The grinding stopped. Footsteps on gravel moving up the embankment. A murmured exchange she couldn't make out. Somewhere up the road, not on the bridge approach, but pulled back from it, a truck engine started. No headlights came on. The sound of the engine faded north on Route 9. Then, there was nothing except Miller Creek and the distant sound of a dog barking twice and going quiet. Nora sat on the ground with her back against the concrete and her knees pulled to her chest, and she thought about what she had seen. She thought about the chapter she had been reading about load distribution and the relationship between structural integrity and applied weight. She thought about what 4 support beams cut 80% through would mean for a bridge deck carrying 15 motorcycles at highway speed. She had read enough to run the calculation in her approximate way, and the approximate answer was that there would be nothing approximate about the outcome. She thought about who she could tell. Sutton. She turned this option over and set it down in approximately 4 seconds. She had watched Dale Merritt's red Dodge park beside Sutton's cruiser too many times. Whatever the nature of their relationship, it was not the kind that ended with Sutton moving against Dale Merritt. Someone else in Grayville. She went through the list of people who had treated her as a human being in 11 months in this town and arrived at Abe Weston, who was 71 years old, and left her sandwiches and was not equipped for this. She did not sleep that night. She sat with her back against the concrete and thought about 15 bikes at full speed and a bridge that wouldn't hold past the first three, and she waited for morning, which was the only thing left she could do. The Iron Oath Brotherhood arrived in Grayville just after 9 in the morning, and they arrived the way they always arrived everywhere, as sound before sight. The rumble of 15 Harley-Davidsons running in tight formation carries through a building before it reaches a window. It was the kind of sound that made people on Main Street stop whatever they were doing and turn toward Route 9. And what they saw coming around the long curve at the edge of town was chrome, catching the morning sun, and 15 men in leather vests riding in a formation that spoke of long practice and the kind of mutual trust that gets built in conditions most people never encounter. Hank Decker rode at the front. He was 52 years old, former United States Marine Corps. 2 deployments he did not discuss in detail with people who hadn't been there. His beard was silver and trimmed close. The lines around his eyes were deep carved not by age alone, but by the kind of sustained attention that becomes permanent in a face. His leather vest was covered in patches unit insignias and memorial pins, and a small American flag stitched carefully over his left breast. He carried himself with the particular stillness of men who have been in situations where stillness was a survival skill and have never entirely come back out of it. Behind him rode Rex Barlow. Rex was ex-Army, built along substantial lines with a handlebar mustache he'd been cultivating for 11 years and opinions about everything that he offered freely and at length. Rex was the kind of man who understood himself to be entertaining and was not entirely wrong about this, though he was wrong about it more often than he recognized. He filled silence the way water fills low ground automatically, and without deliberation moving into every available space. Owen Nash rode behind Rex. He was quiet and thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and a pocket notebook he carried everywhere. He had spent 20 years in the Navy as a structural engineer, working on projects the details of which he was still technically not supposed to discuss. He was the kind of man who noticed the thing other people's eyes moved past the slightly wrong angle. The stress point nobody had documented the number that didn't reconcile with the others. The other writers called him the Professor. Owen didn't discourage it. Cal Rivers was 26, the youngest in the group by a significant margin. Former combat medic, 2 Purple Hearts from a deployment he had finished 18 months ago. He laughed easily and got angry rarely and carried a first aid kit on his bike with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone who had learned that the question was never whether you'd need it, but when. He had joined the Iron Oath Brotherhood 8 months ago at Hank's specific invitation, which was not something Hank extended casually. Dex Moore rode near the back. He had been a drill sergeant for 14 years and had not raised his voice in a decade and did not miss it. He communicated through nods and the quality of his attention, both of which were more precise than most people's words. Cal Rivers had described him once as the man who finishes your sentence in his head 3 seconds before you finish it out loud, and is usually right, which was accurate. The rest of the formation filled in behind. A welder from outside Tallahassee who'd done 3 tours in places he couldn't name in conversation. A retired firefighter from Mobile who still flinched at certain high-pitched sounds and had made a private peace with the fact that he probably always would. A high school history teacher from a small town in Alabama whose students would have been startled to see him here, riding hard on a spring Tuesday with 14 other men who trusted him completely. Each man carried a history that wasn't on display and a loyalty that didn't require explanation. They were traveling from Savannah to Memphis. Annual trip. 3 weeks, a specific route, specific stops. Memorials, cemeteries, headstones of men they had served with, who were no longer around to be served with. They poured whiskey at the graves and said the names out loud and rode on. Grayville was a fuel stop, a bathroom break. Nothing more than that, or so they had planned. When 15 bikes pulled into the lot at Garrett Holt's gas station on Route 9, the town had a visible reaction. Vera Pruitt moved back from her storefront window and reached for the sign to flip it from open to closed. A woman outside the pharmacy pulled her two children closer without appearing to notice she was doing it. Garrett Holt leaned against his station doorframe with his arms crossed and watched the formation come in with the practiced expression of a man performing calm. Hank pulled a folded map from his saddlebag and spread it across the seat of his Harley. His finger traced a line south of town. Millbrook Bridge on Route 9, cut through the valley, saved 2 hours before Memphis. He looked at Owen, who nodded. County records showed the bridge as open and rated for standard vehicle traffic. Nora had been standing in the shadow of the boarded-up laundromat across the street since the engines announced themselves from a mile out. She had stood there and watched the formation come in, and she had counted. 15. She had looked at their faces, at the ease between them, at the way Rex was already making someone laugh, and the way Cal Rivers was showing photographs on his phone to Dex Moore, who was looking at them with the focused attention he gave to everything. She had looked at Hank Decker standing at the front of everything, calm and deliberate, reading a map with the confidence of a man who has been navigating things more complicated than roads for most of his adult life. They had no idea. She crossed the street. She walked into the middle of the gas station lot and stopped with 15 feet between her and the nearest rider, and she said in a voice that was steadier than she felt that they could not take that bridge. Rex Barlow turned first. He looked at her the way he would have looked at an obstacle in a road, assessing and dismissing in the same motion. His eyes moved across the torn jacket, the bare feet, the matted hair, and he had his conclusion before she finished her sentence. She told them what she had seen: the angle grinders, the 4 East Side support beams, Dale Merritt standing on the bank directing 2 workers with a flashlight. The words she had heard through the gap in the 10-15 bikes at full speed won't hold past the first 3. When she finished, there was a pause that lasted exactly long enough for Rex to decide how he wanted to respond. Then he laughed. Not a cruel laugh. The laugh of a man who is fully certain he is right and finds the alternative slightly absurd. He looked at Garrett Holt. Garrett shrugged and said that was the homeless girl lived under the bridge, had some issues. He said it with a sideward look at Nora that made clear she wasn't supposed to take offense because she was not really part of the conversation. Nora said she was standing right there. Rex stepped toward her. He was a large man, and he didn't do it threateningly, just close the distance in the way large men sometimes do without registering what it communicates. He said they had been riding for 6 days and had a memorial to reach in Memphis, and he was not rerouting because a kid who slept in the dirt had a nightmare about a bridge. A few of the other riders shifted their weight. One rubbed the back of his neck. Nobody said anything. Nora felt the heat behind her eyes that she had learned to manage over 11 months of being looked through by this town. It was not exactly anger. It was the particular pain of telling the truth to people who have already decided what you are, the discovery again that the decision was made before you opened your mouth. She had felt it at the grocery store, at the shelter in Colton, at the church on 5th Street, at the police station. It was familiar. That did not make it smaller. She said she had no reason to lie. She said she had nothing which was true in the most literal possible sense. She said she was telling them what she saw because people were going to die. Her voice broke on the last word. She pressed her palm against her mouth and looked at the ground. Rex said the show was over and they should gas up and roll. The engines came back one at a time. The deep, familiar thunder of 15 Harleys, and the formation reassembled with the ease of long practice. In 90 seconds, they would be on Route 9. In 7 minutes, they would reach the Millbrook Bridge. Nora stood in the parking lot with her arms at her sides and did not move. There were tears cutting through the road dust on her face. She did not wipe them. She was done spending energy on things that weren't going to change anything. She looked at the ground. She thought of Ruth, who had taught her that you did the right thing even when it cost you, who had believed this so completely that she had lived the entirety of her life on that principle and died without ever being rewarded for it, in any way the world would call significant. Ruth had stretched every dollar thin and hummed hymns in the kitchen and believed that kindness was the only currency that never lost its value. And she had been right. Even though she had died in a hospital room with unpaid bills and a granddaughter holding her hand and no one to send a card to, Nora had run 2 miles on bare feet in an empty stomach and had done everything she could think of to do. It had not been enough. She understood this in the parking lot with gravel under her feet and the sound of 15 engines filling the air around her. She dropped to her knees, not for effect, because there was nothing left. Her lips moved in the shape of a prayer she had learned sitting beside Ruth on the couch, in the house on Birch Lane, a house that no longer belonged to either of them, in a life that felt like it had belonged to a different person. At the back of the formation, Hank Decker had not restarted his engine. He had been leaning against his Harley with his arms crossed since the beginning of the exchange watching. Not Rex, not Garrett Holt. Her. He had spent 2 decades making judgments about people in conditions where a wrong judgment meant someone went home in a bag. He had learned to look past words to what lived underneath them, the particular texture of genuine terror, the way real fear inhabited a body differently from performed fear. You could not fake the specific exhaustion of someone who had already spent everything trying to be heard and had arrived at the place past trying where only the truth remained. This girl was not performing. He thought about Jamie Alcott. He thought about Jamie's face in the parking lot of the VA facility in Atlanta on the day his paperwork came back lost, and he was told to resubmit and wait 12 to 16 weeks. That expression, the one that meant a person had been trying to be believed for a very long time and had finally run out of what it took to keep trying. He had not been able to do anything for Jamie in that parking lot. He had made phone calls and left messages and tried to navigate a system that was not designed to be navigated from the outside. And Jamie had not made it, and Hank had been carrying that weight for 3 years in the specific way you carry something you cannot put down, because putting it down would mean accepting that there was nowhere to set it. He saw that same expression on the face of a 19-year-old girl kneeling on the asphalt of Garrett Holt's gas station. He killed the thought of leaving before it finished forming. He said in a voice that carried without being raised, "Everybody shut your engines off." Rex said his name, the tone of a man appointing himself a reasonable check on what he was about to call an overreaction. Hank said it again, "Shut them off." 14 engines went silent. The parking lot was suddenly very quiet. Hank walked across the lot to where Nora was kneeling. He did not crouch down to her level. He did not soften his voice or tilt his head. He spoke to her the way you speak to someone whose account you have decided to take seriously, which is directly and without modification. He said, "What's your name?" She said, Nora Callum." He said, "Nora, I'm Hank." You said, "East Side 4 Beams Angle Grinder." How deep were the cuts? She said, "Deep. Maybe 80% through. From above the road surface, you can't tell anything is wrong." Hank looked at Owen. Owen had already removed his glasses and was cleaning them with the hem of his shirt, which was what he did when something had fully engaged his attention and he was reorganizing his thinking around it. Hank said, "Owen, Rex, with me." He looked at Nora. "Show us." The path that ran along Miller Creek was loose gravel and exposed root, the kind of ground that punished inattention. Nora walked it the way she walked everything, with the automatic confidence of someone who had covered this particular quarter-mile in the dark more times than she could count. Hank followed 2 steps behind. Owen carried his canvas toolkit over one shoulder, the kit that went on every ride the way some men carry a spare tire. Because Owen Nash had learned in 20 years of professional practice that the situation requiring a toolkit never announces itself in advance. Rex came last, arms still crossed, mouth set, in the expression of a man who had committed to skepticism and intended to see that commitment through. Nobody spoke. The creek moved beside them, low and clear, unhurried. Spring had not fully arrived, and the trees along the bank held the tentative quality of early leaf more gray than green, the morning light coming through at angles that made the path feel longer than it was. Nora could hear the bridge before she could see it. Around the bend, the faint, hollow resonance that large concrete structures make when wind moves through them, a sound she had learned to sleep under and then learned not to hear at all. When it came into view, it looked the way it always looked. Old, rust-streaked along the girders, unremarkable in the way of things built for function, without any consideration of how they would age. 2 lanes wide, the deck surface cracked in the long parallel lines that characterize concrete past its intended service life. From above, from the road, from any angle a passing driver would ever occupy, the Millbrook Bridge looked like exactly what it was. A 60-year-old rural crossing that had been doing its job without complaint. Rex made a sound that was not quite a word. It contained his assessment of the situation. Nora pointed to the east embankment without speaking. The ground sloped from the road grade to the creek's edge, soft and damp from recent rain, a tangle of exposed root and compressed clay. She had descended this slope dozens of times in the dark. She knew exactly where to place her feet. Hank went down without hesitation. His boots sank into the soft earth. He caught his balance on a root, and he ducked under the bridge deck. He straightened up in the space between the water and the underside of the structure, where the light was flat and gray and smelled like rust and cold mud. He stood without moving for 3 full seconds. Then he said Owen's name, the way you say a name when you need someone there immediately. Owen came down the slope faster than his usual deliberateness. He pulled a flashlight from his kit and aimed it at the first crossbeam on the east side. The cut was clean. That was the first thing. Not the irregular corrosion of steel giving way to decades of load cycling in weather. Not the gradual degradation that accumulated over 60 years of service. Clean. A diagonal slash through the structural steel, precise and deliberate, the angle consistent with a grinding wheel held at a specific orientation by someone operating with intention. The metal at the cut face was bright, not yet oxidized, not yet dulled by exposure to air and moisture. Owen moved the light to the second beam, same cut, same angle, same brightness at the exposed face. Third, fourth. He stood with the light aimed at the fourth cut and was still for a moment. Nora watched him from the slope, her bare feet braced against a root, and she watched his face in the peripheral glow of the flashlight, and she watched him work through the arithmetic. She had done her own version of it in the dark the night before, with the approximate knowledge of someone who had read about structural engineering out of genuine curiosity rather than professional training. Owen was doing it with 20 years of practice behind him. The answer was the same. These cuts are less than 12 hours old, he said. His voice had changed register in the way voices change when information is moved from theoretical to factual. The oxidation pattern, the kerf edge. Someone was here last night with a 4-inch angle grinder. He paused. 4 beams at approximately 80% depth on the east side. He was speaking with the precision of someone who understood that precision was the only responsible option here. At full load, 15 motorcycles, average rider weight plus machine weight, highway speed across this span. The bridge fails in under 2 seconds. The deck drops. The bikes go with it. 30-foot fall into shallow water over rock. He stopped. Nobody walks away from that, he said. Rex had come down the embankment while Owen was speaking. He stood at the edge of the group with the reflected glow of the flashlight reaching his face, looking at the cuts the way a man looks at something that has quietly rearranged everything he was certain of 5 minutes ago. His arms were no longer crossed. His mouth was open slightly. He had been loud and publicly certain, and the steel in front of him was delivering a very specific verdict on that certainty. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the steel was not already saying more clearly. Hank climbed back up the embankment. His face had gone the color of old chalk. Not fear. Hank Decker did not go pale from fear. He went pale from the controlled fury of someone who has encountered deliberate harm engineered against people who did not deserve it, and has locked the fury in the place where it becomes useful rather than the place where it becomes noise. He looked at Nora. She was still on the slope, bare feet braced on a root, arms at her sides. She looked back at him. "You saved our lives," he said. It was 4 words. Simple. Nora had not heard anything directed at her in 14 months that resembled it. She opened her mouth and found that whatever response might exist had not yet arrived, so she closed it and nodded. Rex climbed up the slope and stopped in front of her. He was a large man, and his presence occupied space whether he intended it to or not. He stood for a moment with something working through his expression, something that was taking effort and which he was not going to shortcut. Then he reached down and unzipped his riding gloves and held them out. He said, "I'm sorry for what I said back there." Nora looked at the gloves. She took them. They called Sutton because that was the correct procedural sequence, and Hank was a man who followed correct sequences even when he suspected they would fail. He made the call standing at the top of the embankment with 15 riders watching from the road above. He gave the location, described what they had found, and said they needed an immediate response. Roy Sutton arrived 22 minutes later in his department-issue SUV, moving at the pace of a man who had mentally classified this call somewhere below urgent before he left the parking lot. He had coffee in the center console. He kept his sunglasses on, stepping out of the vehicle. He hitched his belt and looked at the bridge the way you look at a building a neighbor has complained about that you are already confident is structurally sound. He said, "So what are we dealing with here?" Hank described what Owen had found. 4 support beams on the east side. Machine cuts less than 12 hours old, deliberate sabotage. The bridge had been engineered to fail under the weight of their convoy. Sutton walked to the edge of the embankment. He bent slightly at the waist and looked underneath for approximately 4 seconds. Then he straightened and brushed at the knees of his uniform, though he had not knelt. He said it looked like standard material fatigue to him, said the bridge was 60 years old, said steel fatigued. Owen stepped forward. He said, "Chief, I'm a structural engineer, retired Navy. I have inspected bridges and load-bearing structures on 3 continents over 20 years. Those cuts are machine-made. The kerf angle is consistent with a 4-inch angle grinder operating at approximately 11,000 revolutions per minute. The oxidation pattern puts the cutting between 10 and 14 hours ago. Steel does not fatigue in clean diagonal lines with polished faces. That is not weathering. That is a tool operated by a person with a purpose." Sutton looked at Owen the way a man looks at a menu printed in a language he doesn't read. Patiently, without comprehension. He said he appreciated the expertise and that he had been chief in this town for 19 years and knew this bridge. Nora said then, "You know it was fine last week." Sutton's head turned toward her. It was a small, deliberate movement, the turn of a man redirecting attention to a variable he has chosen to address. His expression behind the sunglasses was flat in a specific way, flat like a thing that has been made flat, rather than a thing that is naturally without texture. He said, "Miss Callum, this isn't your concern." The words landed and something changed in the quality of the air around them. Nora felt it before she understood it. She stood on the embankment slope and went back through the past 3 minutes with the methodical attention of someone reconstructing a sequence. Sutton had arrived. Sutton had gotten out of his vehicle. Garrett Holt had identified her to Rex in the gas station parking lot, not here, not anywhere Sutton could have heard. Hank had introduced himself to Sutton. Owen had introduced himself. Nobody had said her name. Nobody had told Roy Sutton who she was. He had known it anyway. She looked at Hank. She said he knew my name. Nobody told him my name. The silence that followed was different from the one at the bridge. It was the silence of people who have just been handed a piece of information that changes the shape of everything around it and are taking a moment to let the reshaping happen. Hank's eyes moved to Owen. Owen was not cleaning his glasses this time. He held them loosely at his side and looked at Sutton with the focused neutrality of someone running a calculation they have just found a new variable for. Owen said, "I've been recording since we came down the embankment. Audio and video. I have his arrival, his inspection, his statement about wear and tear, and what he just said." A degree of tension entered Sutton's shoulders. Not dramatic, the settling of weight that is slightly different from what came before. He said the county inspector would have a look next week. Said he'd put up a road closed sign in the meantime. Said he trusted that satisfied everyone. He turned and walked back to his SUV with the deliberateness of a man who does not intend to be called back. Hank watched the vehicle until it turned the corner onto Route 9 and disappeared. Then he looked at Owen. He said, "Call the FBI field office in Albany. Tell them we have documented evidence of attempted murder and the local police chief as a probable co-conspirator. Tell them we have video of both the crime scene and the chief's response. Tell them to move." Owen already had his phone out. Hank looked at Nora. He said Merritt, the bar on Creston Avenue. She said Iron Mule. He said, "How well does he know Sutton?" She said they drink together every Thursday night. Sutton's cruiser is parked out back until 2 in the morning sometimes. I've seen them together outside the bar 6, 7 times in the past year. They don't perform it for anyone. They're just two men who know each other the way men know each other when they've been useful to each other for a long time. Hank nodded, the nod of someone confirming a shape they had already begun to perceive. Owen returned and said Albany was sending 2 agents 45 minutes estimated, and that the duty agent had asked them not to approach the primary suspect before federal personnel arrived. Hank said he understood. He stood looking south down Route 9 toward Creston Avenue, toward the Iron Mule, toward the town. The morning had moved past 10 o'clock. The light was clear and full, the kind of spring morning that makes everything look slightly more definite than it is. Nora was already looking south. She saw the smoke before anyone else because she was looking at a specific building rather than the road in general. It was faint, the kind of thing that registers as a visual irregularity before the brain has a word for it, a smudge of gray rising from the upper window of the Iron Mule side office. Not a chimney, not exhaust from the kitchen. The wrong color and the wrong movement pattern for either of those things. She understood what it was. She understood what it meant. Dale Merritt had heard from Sutton. However, the word had traveled a call from the SUV before it rounded the corner, a text arranged in advance as a signal. It did not matter. Dale knew they had found the bridge and knew about the federal call and understood that whatever existed in that office needed to stop existing before the agents from Albany arrived. The equipment rental receipts, the paperwork that tied the angle grinders to his account, the timeline documents, whatever map or diagram existed, all of it in that room, and that room was producing smoke. 45 minutes. If there was nothing left when the FBI arrived, Dale Merritt would have a bar full of people to account for his evening, and Sutton would have 19 years of institutional standing, and a county bridge inspector would eventually file a report attributing the structural compromise to material fatigue. And 2 federal agents would drive back down Route 9 with a case that had no physical evidence and a witness who was a homeless 19-year-old that the entire town of Grayville had spent a year declining to see. Nora understood all of this in approximately the same time it took to identify the smoke as smoke. She also understood that she was the only person in this group looking in the right direction at the right moment. By the time she explained the situation to Hank, and Hank processed it, and the group reached a decision, the fire would have accomplished its purpose. She did not wait. She said, "The office is burning. He's destroying the evidence. I'm going." Hank said her name, the sharp version. She was already moving. She went down Route 9 at a run, bare feet on warm asphalt, the same feet that had covered 2 miles before dawn, and she did not slow when she turned onto Creston Avenue, and the Iron Mule came into view ahead of her. The smoke from the upper window was thicker now, visible from half a block away. The bar's front door was closed, no customers visible on the sidewalk. She did not have a plan past the next 60 seconds. What she had was the understanding that Dale Merritt would not continue burning documents in the presence of a witness. He would stop. He would need to manage the witness. Managing the witness would take time. Time was what the situation required. She pushed open the front door of the Iron Mule and walked in. The bar was dim in the way of bars on Tuesday mornings, lit by neon beer signs and the thin light coming through the front windows. It smelled like old wood and spilled beer and the accumulated memory of cigarette smoke from years before the indoor ban. 4 men occupied stools at the long counter regulars. By the look of them, men for whom this was simply where they were at 10 in the morning, the same way other men were at offices or workshops. They looked up when the door opened and looked back at their drinks. Dale Merritt was behind the bar. He was heavy-set, late 40s, gray heavily through the dark hair he kept short, flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had a dish towel in his hand that he'd been using without purpose, the motion of a man who needed something to do with his hands. When the door opened, he looked up with the automatic attention of a bar owner assessing a new arrival, and then he saw who had come through the door, and the dish towel went absolutely still. Nora walked to the bar. She pulled out a stool and sat down. She placed Rex's riding gloves on the bar surface beside her hands and looked at Dale Merritt with the level attention of someone who has decided not to perform anything. She said, "Can I get a glass of water?" Dale did not move. She had seen fear on faces before, the version that came when a situation had stopped being theoretical and arrived in the room with you. Dale Merritt was looking at her the way a man looks at something that should not be in front of him, but is the specific disruption of a reality that has stopped matching the plan. She was not supposed to be here. She was the homeless girl who slept under the bridge. She was not supposed to know what she knew. She was not supposed to walk into his bar on a Tuesday morning and sit down and look at him with the unruffled patience of someone who had all the time in the world. He could not keep burning. Not with her sitting there. Not with a witness at the bar in front of 4 other witnesses. He could not make her leave without creating a scene the 4 men at the counter would remember with clarity. He could not call Sutton because Sutton was already in the situation, and additional complexity would only make it worse. He set the dish towel on the bar. He reached under the counter, produced a glass, filled it from the tap, and set it in front of her without speaking. Nora picked it up and drank, set it back down, looked at him. He looked at her. The 4 men at the bar were watching a baseball recap on the television in the corner and were not paying attention to either of them. Dale said, "You should go home." Nora said, "I don't have one." The silence stretched. Dale's jaw was tight. He was working through options when the available options were all bad, assessing each and discarding it, arriving at the same conclusion from every direction. He could not make her leave without making a memory that would be a problem later. He could not finish in the office while she was sitting there. He could not call for reinforcements without compounding everything. He had to wait her out and trust she would leave before whatever was coming arrived. Nora picked up the glass and held it and counted time internally, the way she had learned to count time in the dark under the bridge when she needed to know how far away dawn was. She counted to 60 and started again. At around the 8th minute, Dale glanced at the door behind the bar leading to the office. The glance lasted a fraction of a second longer than it should have. She watched him calculate whether what was left in there could be finished before the situation came to a head. She said, "The FBI is about 40 minutes out from Albany." Dale went completely still. She said, "They're bringing someone who actually looks at evidence." His hands were flat on the bar, and she could see the tension in them, the way the tendons stood against the surface. He was a man standing at the terminus of a long sequence of decisions, looking at where those decisions had delivered him, which was a Tuesday morning in his own establishment, with a homeless teenager telling him federal agents were coming. The front door of the Iron Mule opened, then the side door. Rex Barlow filled the front entrance with his shoulders, and Hank Decker was 2 steps behind him, and through the side came Cal Rivers and Dex Moore, and 3 others. And within 45 seconds, the Iron Mule contained 15 men in road-worn leather moving through the space, with the quiet efficiency of people who have executed more complicated entries in considerably higher stakes conditions. Cal Rivers and another man took the back exit, 2 more at the front door. The rest formed a loose arc around the bar. The 4 Tuesday morning regulars had gone completely still on their stools, drinks in front of them forgotten. Dale Merritt stood behind the bar and looked at Hank Decker and understood that the sequence of the morning had completed. Hank walked to the bar. He did not sit. He stood across from Dale with his hands loose at his sides and his voice at its normal register, which did not need volume to carry authority. He said, "Dale Merritt, we know the bridge. We know last night. We have a witness who heard you give the instructions, and we have a structural engineer who documented the cuts this morning on video. What we came here for is whatever's in that office before you finish destroying it." Owen was already moving. He went past the end of the bar, put his shoulder to the office door, and stepped inside. There was a metal trash can in the corner with papers burning in it, the remains curled black smoke still rising. Owen pulled the can from the desk, stamped on the edges of the fire with his boot, and assessed what remained. He looked at the desk. He looked at the floor where papers had been pushed or fallen. He called out in a level voice. He said he had a partial equipment rental receipt with a Route 9 address partially legible at the bottom. He said he had a handwritten note with a dollar figure 60,000 and two initials. He said he had a printed road map with a circle marked in ink around a specific location. The location was the Millbrook Bridge. Hank looked at Dale. Dale said, "You don't understand the whole situation." Hank said he was starting to. Dale said the bar was under, said he owed money to people who did not accept payment arrangements, said nobody was supposed to die, that he thought the bikes would stop before crossing when someone noticed something was wrong with the approach. Owen appeared in the office doorway. He said 30-foot drop onto rock in 8 inches of water. You ran the same calculation I did this morning. You just decided the outcome was acceptable. Dale did not say anything. The front door of the Iron Mule opened again. Roy Sutton walked in. He walked the way men walk when they expect a room to rearrange itself around their arrival. Chest forward. The authority of 19 years carried in his posture like a credential he had never had to show because no one had ever asked to see it. He got 3 steps inside and stopped. 15 men in leather. Nora Callum sitting at the bar with a glass of water. Dale Merritt standing behind the counter looking like a man who had reached the end of something. Sutton's hand dropped from his belt. Dale looked at him from across the bar. Just looked. For a moment, nothing was said, and in that moment, the 4 men on the bar stools and the 15 riders and Owen in the office doorway all watched the exchange, and what the exchange contained was legible without any words. Dale said Roy, not Chief, not Officer Sutton, not any form of address that carried institutional distance. Just the name. The name of a man he had known long enough and closely enough that the name alone carried the entire history of what they were to each other. One word that told everyone in the room everything they needed to know. Hank said, Chief Sutton, we have your associate attempting to destroy evidence. We have you on video this morning declining to investigate a documented crime scene, and we have a witness who can speak to the duration and nature of your relationship with Mr. Merritt. The FBI will want to address all 3 of those things. Sutton said nothing. From outside came the sound of tires on gravel, measured and unhurried. 2 vehicles, heavy doors opening with the regulated mechanical precision of government-issue hardware. Through the front windows of the Iron Mule, visible between the neon signs, 2 black SUVs sat at the curb with their engines off and their federal plates catching the midday light. Owen checked his watch. He said 43 minutes. 2 agents came through the door with credentials out and voices measured. They did not perform authority. They operated from it. They assessed the room in under 10 seconds and began the process of separating it into its components. Dale Merritt was directed to the far end of the bar. Roy Sutton was directed to the near wall. Different agents, different positions, different sets of questions. The architecture of a federal investigation assembling itself efficiently around the wreckage of what the 2 men had constructed together. Nora Callum set her water glass on the bar. She had been sitting there for 12 minutes. She looked at Hank. He nodded once. She got up and walked out of the Iron Mule into the midday light of Creston Avenue and stood on the sidewalk and breathed. The street outside the Iron Mule had gone quiet in the way streets go quiet when something significant is happening inside a building, and the people outside can feel it without knowing the details. A gathering had formed on the sidewalk across Creston Avenue, drawn by the federal plates and the 15 motorcycles parked along the curb, and the particular quality of stillness that precedes official action. They stood in the loose configuration of people who want to watch without appearing to watch. Hands in pockets, conversations dropped to murmurs. Nora stood on the sidewalk in front of the bar. She was aware of being looked at. It was a different quality of attention than she had received in 14 months in this town. For 14 months, when Grayville looked toward her, it had used the practiced non-focus of people who have decided something does not warrant seeing. This was different. These eyes were landing on her, registering her, trying to place her in the new context that the past 3 hours had constructed around her. She stood on the sidewalk and did not look away from any of it. After a while, the front door of the Iron Mule opened and Dale Merritt came out with an agent on each side. He came down the steps to the sidewalk, and his path brought him briefly past Nora, and he looked at her. Not with anger, not with the calculating flatness she had seen across the bar. He looked at her with something closer to a man encountering a variable he had fundamentally failed to account for and understanding too late exactly why the accounting had failed. He was put in the back of the first SUV. Roy Sutton came out 3 minutes later. He walked out with his belt hitched and his uniform straight, maintaining the surface of a thing long after the interior had given way. He reached the bottom of the steps and looked at the crowd across Creston Avenue with the reflex authority of 19 years, and the crowd looked back at him without reorganizing itself the way it would have reorganized itself the day before. He got into the second SUV without looking at Nora. The doors closed, the vehicles pulled away from the curb with the quiet finality of things that do not need to announce themselves. No sirens. The crowd watched them go. The crowd was larger now. 40 people or more along the sidewalk across Creston Avenue, drawn through the channels by which news moves through a town of 4,000, which are numerous and rapid. For the first time in 14 months, every set of eyes on that sidewalk was directed at Nora Callum. Not past her, not through her. At her with the focused attention of people trying to understand what they were seeing, which was a 19-year-old girl in a torn jacket and bare feet who had just watched the chief of police leave in a federal vehicle. Nora stood on the sidewalk and did not look away. She had earned this. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated in any way that cashed out as satisfaction. What she felt was the profound exhaustion that had been waiting behind the adrenaline all morning, and underneath the exhaustion, something else, something for which she did not have a clean word. The feeling of having done the thing you were supposed to do and having it cost exactly what you expected and more. Hank came out of the Iron Mule last. He stood beside her for a moment looking at the crowd. He said, "You okay?" She said she was fine. He nodded. He understood the difference between fine as an answer and fine as a fact. And he understood that sometimes the answer was what was available and the fact could be deferred. Rex Barlow came out and positioned himself near Nora without announcement, arms crossed, face set in the expression of a man standing guard without making a production of it. Cal Rivers and Dex Moore came out together, Cal with the easy readiness he brought to everything, Dex with the particular quality of attention that made his silences feel inhabited rather than empty. Dex looked at Nora once and then looked at the crowd, and the look communicated that he had assessed the situation and found it satisfactory, which from Dex Moore was the equivalent of a speech. The morning moved toward noon. Eventually, Hank sat down on the curb. He simply lowered himself to the concrete edge and sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at the street. After a moment, Nora sat beside him in the same position, forearms on knees looking at the same stretch of asphalt. The crowd across the street had mostly dispersed. A few people remained talking quietly, casting occasional glances toward the curb, where a 52-year-old Marine and a 19-year-old girl were sitting 2 inches apart with the settled quality of people who have been through something together and arrived on the other side of it. Hank said, "Where did you grow up?" She said, "Here, 2 blocks from the church on 5th Street. He said, "Parents." She said, "My grandmother raised me." Ruth. She passed 14 months ago. My mother left when I was 3. My father is a name I've never looked up. She said it the way she said most things about her own situation, with the plainness of someone describing geography. No self-pity in the construction of the sentences, just the shape of things as they were. He said, "Ruth sounds like she was something." She said she was the best person I ever knew. She made biscuits from scratch every Sunday. Took longer than any reasonable person would spend on biscuits. She read every night until she couldn't hold the book at the right angle, and then I'd hold it for her and read aloud, and she'd fall asleep in her chair, and I'd put the Afghan over her and keep going until I got tired too. Hank said, "And you kept reading after." She said, "Every day. The county library on Tuesdays and Fridays. Mrs. Patterson lets me stay until closing. I've been through most of the 3rd floor twice." He said, "What do you read?" She said everything. History mostly. Engineering. I finished a book about bridge construction last month. She paused. She said ironic. The corner of her mouth moved. Hank saw it and the corner of his own mouth moved in response. He said you were in 11th grade when the school situation ended. She said no permanent address means no enrollment. No enrollment means no transcript. No transcript means no future. That's the math. He said, I've heard that math before. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the street. Then he said I had a man in my unit, Jamie Alcott, 2 deployments with me. When he came home the second time, the VA lost his intake paperwork. Benefits delayed, transitional housing unavailable. Couldn't hold a job that paid enough to hold an apartment. The system is built to help people who already have a foothold. He didn't have one. Nobody stopped to give him one. Nora said what happened to him. Hank looked at the street. The light had shifted while they were sitting there. The sun moved past noon, the shadows on the pavement at different angles than before. He said he didn't make it. He said it the same way Nora described her family. The shape of a fact that has been carried long enough to no longer require additional words. He said, I think about what would have been different if someone had just stopped. Not offered to pray, not put him on a list. Stopped and actually looked at him and done something that cost them something real. Nora looked at him. She said, you stopped this morning. He said, you gave me a reason to look. They sat with that for a moment. Then Hank stood up. He extended his hand down to her. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet and held on for one additional second with the grip of someone making a point that does not require articulation, and then let go. He said, stay here. He walked to the center of the road where the other 14 riders had collected in a loose group near the bikes, and they looked at his face when he arrived and went quiet. He said, we're not leaving tonight. Rex said, Memphis. Hank said, Memphis can wait. We have something to do here first. 14 men looked at him, then at Nora on the curb, then back at him. Not one of them argued. Not one asked for elaboration. They had ridden together long enough to understand that when Hank said something needed doing, the nature of it would reveal itself in the doing. They set up camp in the empty lot behind Garrett Holt's gas station, which was the largest open space in the area, and which Garrett did not object to, partly because Hank asked with the directness of someone who expected a yes, and partly because Garrett Holt had watched what happened that morning and was in the early stages of a private reconsideration that would take several more days to complete. Tents went up in 20 minutes, bedrolls, coolers, and tool bags arranged with efficiency. Rex sourced cinder blocks from behind the hardware store on Jefferson and built a fire pit that worked better than it had any right to given its construction time. By the time the afternoon light went gold, the lot behind Garrett's station looked like something between a campsite and a forward operating base, because that was effectively what it was. Hank sat on an overturned crate with a spiral notebook and his phone and worked for 4 hours without stopping. He called the Veterans Motorcycle Alliance regional coordinator in Atlanta. He called a man he had served with, who now ran a construction supply operation in Macon. He called a journalist at the regional paper who had been waiting 3 years for Hank to call in a favor. He called a former Marine captain who now worked in nonprofit housing development and listened to Hank describe the situation in Grayville for 6 minutes and then said, "What do you need?" By the time the fire was going and everyone had eaten, a fundraising page had gone up under the name Nora's Bridge. By the following morning, it had been shared enough times that the number on it had a comma and was moving upward faster than anyone in camp had modeled. On the first morning of what would come to be known in Grayville, simply as the week, Owen Nash drove to the Millbrook Bridge before full sunrise. He walked every inch of the structure with a flashlight and a notebook and produced by 8 o'clock a handwritten repair plan of sufficient technical specificity that a licensed contractor could have executed it from the notes alone. He carried the notebook into Peterson's Hardware on Main Street, placed it on the counter, and told the man behind the register that he needed everything on the list by noon and that it was for repairing the bridge that someone in this town had tried to destroy. Old Mr. Peterson looked at the list. He looked at Owen. He did not charge for any of it. The riders divided into crews with the natural efficiency of men who have done enough different things to know where they are most useful. 4 on demolition, working the damaged beams with cutting torches, and a borrowed winch removing the compromised steel with the focused thoroughness of people who understand that the first step of fixing something is fully acknowledging the extent of what is broken. 4 on fabrication, cutting new support steel from I-beams that arrived on a flatbed from Atlanta early on the second afternoon. 4 on installation, working the new beams into position with the coordination of people who trust each other's judgment enough to stop requiring confirmation of it. Cal Rivers worked the installation crew with the same focused efficiency he had once applied to keeping men alive in the field, moving between positions, with the easy competence of someone for whom high-stakes situations requiring rapid physical problem-solving were simply familiar territory. Dex Moore said nothing, as was his practice, and accomplished more than 3 men who talked through everything they did, which was also his practice. Rex Barlow and 2 others handled what Rex called community relations, which in practice meant standing at the bridge approach and explaining to Grayville residents who stopped their cars to look what was happening and why. Rex turned out to be better at this than he might have predicted. The same quality that made him fill a room with his presence made him effective at explaining complicated things to strangers in plain language without condescension, which was a more valuable skill than he had previously credited. Nora worked alongside them from the second day. She arrived at the bridge at dawn wearing Rex's gloves and carrying a thermos of coffee she had gotten from somewhere, and she did not ask permission, and nobody suggested she needed to. She hauled tools, she ran water, she held components in position while measurements were verified. When Owen needed a second set of hands on a calculation, she stood beside him and followed his explanation without requiring him to simplify any part of it. And at one point she caught an arithmetic error before he did, which he acknowledged without embarrassment, and which she did not make anything of. On the third morning, Abe Weston's battered pickup came down the road at 7 o'clock and parked at the end of the bridge approach. Abe got out, opened the tailgate, and began unloading his tools without any announcement of intention. When Hank walked over, Abe said he figured they could use an extra pair of hands. Hank said they could use 20 pairs. Abe said to give it an hour. He was right. By 8 o'clock, there were 5 Grayville residents working alongside the riders. By 9, there were 12. By noon, the Millbrook Bridge site had the quality of a barn raising. From an earlier time, a community effort assembling from the individual decisions of people who had each privately and in their own time arrived at the same conclusion about what the moment required. A retired county road worker arrived with his own equipment and took over the concrete work on the abutments, saying it had needed attention for 2 years and nobody had gotten to it. A man who did agricultural welding offered his truck as a mobile work platform for the installation. 2 high school boys showed up without being asked and spent a full day moving materials from the road to the worksite and back, not saying much. Watching everything with the focused attention of young people encountering adult competence for the first time and finding it more interesting than they expected. On the 4th day, Vera Pruitt arrived. She came in her station wagon with the rear seats folded down and the back loaded with food. Sandwiches enough for 25 people. Cases of water. Apples. A covered dish she had spent the previous evening making chicken and rice that she carried carefully from the car and set on the folding table someone had set up under the oak by the east embankment. She arranged things on the table with the focused attention of a woman who is using the arrangement of objects to manage a feeling she does not yet have words for. She straightened napkins that did not require straightening. She opened and closed a cooler twice without removing anything. Then she walked to where Nora was kneeling on the bridge deck holding a bolt in position against the flange, while Owen worked below. Vera stood there. Nora looked up. Vera had a sandwich in one hand and a bottle of water in the other, and her eyes were red at the edges in the way of someone who has been crying privately and has almost but not entirely composed herself back together. She said, "Nora, she said I chased you out of my store. In the rain. You were cold and wet and I chased you out with a broom." Her voice broke on the last word. Quietly. The way voices break when the truth of a thing is finally being said plainly, and the speaker is only now understanding how true it is. She held out the sandwich. She said, "I'm sorry. I am so sorry." Nora looked at her for a moment, not with coldness, not with the performance of forgiveness that requires an audience to be meaningful. She looked at Vera Pruitt the way Ruth would have looked at her, with the simple directness of someone who understands what the moment calls for and knows it is not a speech. She took the sandwich. She said, "Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt." That was all. Two sentences and the thing was done, not erased, not made clean, but acknowledged and set down the way things get set down between people who are going to continue living in the same town and have decided to proceed. Owen's voice came up from below the deck. He said the torque was good and she could release the bolt. She released it and got to her feet and took a drink of water from the bottle Vera was still holding out, and Vera nodded and went back to the table under the oak. The bridge took 6 days from the morning Owen walked it with a flashlight to the afternoon. He stood at its center and ran his final checks and signed off with the stamping die he had carried since his Navy service, pressing his certification into paper with the authority of a credential earned over 2 decades of work on structures the government had considered important enough to classify. He gathered the group at the east railing and said the bridge was structurally sound for its rated load capacity, and he was prepared to put his name to that in any context where it was required. Rex said, "So we can ride it." Owen said, "You can ride it." Rex put his hand flat on the railing and stood there for a moment and did not say anything, which was unusual enough that the men nearby noticed it. On the evening of the 6th day, Hank found Nora sitting on the curb behind Garrett's station, the same stretch of concrete where they had talked days earlier. She was looking at nothing particular with the quality of attention that follows the completion of something that has taken everything, the specific blankness of a mind that has been fully occupied and is only now being given permission to stop. He sat down beside her. He said, "Walk with me tomorrow morning." She said, "Where?" He said, "You'll see." She had learned by this point that Hank did not explain things before they were ready to be explained, and that this was not evasion, but a preference for showing over describing. So she said, "Okay," and they sat in the comfortable quiet of people who had stopped needing to fill the space between them with anything. The fundraising page had passed $127,000. Hank had a plan for every dollar. In the morning, he came to the spot under the bridge that had been Nora's home for 11 months and waited without announcing himself until she came out. She had her jacket on and her feet were bare, and she had the alertness of someone accustomed to waking up in readiness, because readiness was what the situation had always required. He said ready, she said yes. They walked down Main Street in the early light, the town coming awake around them. A delivery truck outside the hardware store. Someone opening blinds at the diner on the corner. A man Nora had passed dozens of times without exchanging a word, looked up from unlocking his shop and said, "Morning, Nora." She almost stopped walking. She kept walking. Hank turned onto Birch Lane. Nora felt the change in herself before she processed where they were going. A kind of bracing, the physical preparation of someone approaching something they have been routing around. She had not walked down Birch Lane since the man in the gray suit changed the locks on 412 and drove away. She had taken a different street for 14 months, not because she had forgotten, but because the route around it was the one that let her keep moving. They walked the full length of the block. At 412 Birch Lane, Nora stopped. The porch was level. That was the first thing. The porch that had been listing slightly left for as long as she could remember was straight now, rebuilt with lumber still holding the pale color of fresh-cut wood before weatherworks on it. The roof had new shingles, gray and even clean against the morning sky. The gutters were reattached and straight. The porch swing was still there, and for a moment Nora looked at it with the specific quality of attention that comes when you identify an artifact from a life that has ended, but the chains were new and the wood had been sanded and sealed. The front door had been painted, sky blue, the precise blue of a clear October day when the air is cold enough that the color looks saturated deeper than summer blue. Nora stood and looked at it and did not entirely understand why this detail was the one that reached her most directly. Maybe because it was unnecessary in the structural sense. A choice about what color something should be. Someone had stood in front of that door with a paint can and had chosen a color that was without equivocation hopeful. Hank walked up the steps and opened the door. He stepped aside. She went in. Fresh paint and sawdust. the smell of new material settling into a space that had been remade. The floors had been sanded and sealed and caught the morning light from the windows in long, pale strips. The kitchen had new countertops, simple laminate, nothing expensive but clean and even, and without the water stains and edge curling of what had been there before. The living room had a couch that was clearly secondhand but solid, and a reading lamp in the corner, and against the wall a bookshelf. The bookshelf was full. Nora walked to it. Her fingers moved along the spine slowly. History, science, engineering. Two novels she had checked out of the county library and returned and thought about for weeks afterward. A collection of essays she had never encountered before whose title made her stop and read it twice. She pulled one book out and looked at the inside cover, and there was a small card tucked into the front. It said, "Mrs. Patterson chose these. She said she knew what you'd want." Nora put the book back carefully. She walked to the back bedroom. The bed was made with clean linen. There was a nightstand and a lamp. On the nightstand, there was a framed photograph. Ruth Callum sat in the porch swing of 412 Birch Lane. It was summer in the photograph, the trees behind her full and green, and she was holding a glass of sweet tea, and she was laughing at something that had been said a half second before the shutter opened. She looked exactly the way she had looked on hundreds of summer evenings, completely at ease in the way of people who have decided to be exactly where they are. Nora picked up the frame with both hands. Hank spoke from the doorway. He said Abe found it at the pawn shop on Jefferson. When the bank cleared the house, someone sold off a box of things from inside. Abe went into the shop for something unrelated and saw the box on the counter and recognized the address written on a piece of paper in the top of it. He bought the whole box. He had no way to find you. He kept it in his shop for 11 months because he believed you would need it eventually. He didn't know when. He just kept it. Nora looked at the photograph. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She held the frame against her chest with both hands, and she pressed her eyes shut, and the sound that came out of her was nothing like the controlled, quiet tears she had produced in parking lots and on curbs over 14 months of learning to grieve in places where no one would be disturbed by it. This was different. This was the sound of a wall that had been holding for a very long time, finally releasing loud and complete, and without any management or modification. The kind of crying that takes over a person's breathing and shakes their shoulders and cannot be made smaller by effort. Hank stood in the doorway and said nothing. He had stood in doorways like this before. He knew what this was and what it required, which was not words and not organized comfort, but simply the presence of another person who was not going to leave. And so he stood in the doorway of the back bedroom of 412 Birch Lane and stayed there until it subsided. When Nora looked up, her face was swollen and her eyes were red, and she looked like someone who has just set down something she has been carrying for a very long time and whose arms are still adjusting to the absence of the weight. She said, "Why? You don't know me." Hank said, "I know enough. I know you ran 2 miles barefoot in the dark to save 15 strangers. I know you didn't stop when every reason to was handed to you. I know you walked into that man's bar alone and bought us 14 minutes with a glass of water, and none of us asked you to do that." He paused. He said, "And I know Jamie Alcott didn't make it because nobody stopped. I've been carrying that for 3 years looking for somewhere to put it. This is where it goes." Outside, Birch Lane had filled while they were inside. Nora came out onto the porch and stopped at the top of the steps. The street was full of people. Not a planned event, not a ceremony someone had organized and announced, but Grayville accumulating of its own accord, the way towns accumulate around things that matter, drawn through the same channels that had carried every piece of news all week. The 15 riders stood along the curb with their helmets off and their hands at their sides. Abe Weston was near the back with his arms folded and the smile of a man who does not need the moment to be about him. Vera Pruitt was there with her hand over her mouth. Garrett Holt stood to one side with the expression of a man in the early stages of becoming someone different from who he was a week ago, and finding the process uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. Mrs. Elaine Patterson from the county library stood near the porch steps, holding a canvas tote bag that she extended toward Nora when she came out. Inside were 3 books Nora had been on the reserve wait list for. She said she thought Nora might want them now that she had a better place to read. Children were on their father's shoulders to see over the crowd. An older woman Nora did not recognize held a hand-painted sign that said, "Welcome home, Nora," in letters that were not quite even and did not need to be. Across the street between 2 oak trees, someone had stretched a white bedsheet and written on it in black spray paint in letters that were crooked and completely honest, "Grayville stands with Nora Callum." Bryn Harmon stepped forward from the crowd. She had been elected to complete Sutton's term after a special council session 3 days prior, and she was a direct woman in her early 50s who had been waiting for an opportunity to be useful in a way that matched the scale of her capacity. She said, "Nora, on behalf of the Grayville Town Council, I am announcing the creation of the Ruth Callum Community Fund. Emergency housing meals and educational support for any person in this town who needs it funded in perpetuity from contributions that are still arriving from across the country." She held out an envelope. Nora came down the porch steps and took it. Inside was a letter. Walker County Community College. Full scholarship. Tuition books and a housing stipend funded jointly by the Veterans Motorcycle Alliance and matched by the state of Georgia. Beginning the following fall semester. No conditions except enrollment. Nora stood on the bottom step of 412 Birch Lane with the letter in her hand and looked at the street full of people who were finally seeing her. Hank spoke from the porch behind her. He spoke to everyone, not to Nora, in the voice he used when the words needed to carry and mean something when they arrived. He said she saved 15 lives with nothing but the decision to keep going when every reason to stop was given to her. The least we can do is make sure she never has to sleep under a bridge again. The applause came from everywhere at once. It built as it came, and someone whistled, and someone called her name, and the sound moved down Birch Lane and came back off the houses and filled the air above the street. And Nora stood on the bottom step and did not look away from any of it. 6 months later, Nora Callum sat in the front row of a lecture hall at Walker County Community College with her notebook open and her pen moving. When the professor reached the end of a question, she had her hand up before he finished the sentence. She was taking structural engineering and material science and a history of American infrastructure that met on Tuesday mornings and which she had not missed once. She carried her books in a canvas bag Owen Nash had mailed from Virginia with a note that said it had survived 2 deployments and ought to be able to handle a semester of coursework. In the front pocket, she kept Abe's flashlight. She did not need it for reading anymore. She kept it the way you keep things that mark the distance between who you were and who you are in the process of becoming. On weekends, she volunteered at the Ruth Callum Community Shelter on Main Street, a converted storefront that had opened in October with the support of the fund and the labor of people who had shown up the way they had shown up at the bridge because they had decided to. Nobody in Grayville slept outside anymore. The shelter had more volunteers than it had beds, which was the correct direction for that ratio to run. Vera Pruitt ran the kitchen on Sundays. Pot roast and cornbread and peach cobbler from a recipe she said had been her mother's, which she was not entirely certain was accurate, but which produced the result that mattered. She did not speak about the broom or the rainstorm. She did not need to. What she did every Sunday said the thing the words would only have approximated. Abe Weston still left brown paper bags on the railing of the Millbrook Bridge. The habit had outlasted its original purpose and become something else, a standing offer with no recipient specified. Sometimes the bags came back with notes inside, folded small thank you, in different handwritings from people he had never met. He kept the notes in a drawer in the shop on Route 4 and did not mention them to anyone. The Iron Oath Brotherhood came through Grayville twice a year, spring and fall. 15 Harleys down Main Street in the same formation. The town's response had reversed completely. People came out of their shops. Vera Pruitt set lemonade on a table outside the grocery store. Rex Barlow, who had been the loudest voice against Nora in the gas station parking lot on a Tuesday morning in spring, corresponded regularly now with Garrett Holt, who was by all accounts becoming a meaningfully different version of himself, which was a process that appeared to suit him. Hank Decker always stopped at 412 Birch Lane first. He would come up the porch steps, and Nora would be there, or would come to the door when she heard the engine, and they would sit in the porch swing. that still made the same sound it had always made. The new chains producing the same creak as the old ones, because that was the nature of porch swings, and neither of them would have changed it. They talked about her coursework, about a paper she was writing on load distribution and long-span bridge structures that her professor had described as the most technically assured undergraduate work he had encountered in 11 years of teaching. About books, about what it meant to understand how things held together. They talked about Jamie Alcott sometimes, not with grief exactly, with the seriousness that the dead deserve when the living take the time to say their names out loud, which is a way of saying that the person still matters, which is the most anyone can do. One afternoon in October, 6 months after the week that had changed Grayville's understanding of itself and its obligations, Nora walked to the Millbrook Bridge alone. The light was going gold and long the way it does in October, when the air has a weight to it that summer light doesn't carry. The creek was running higher than usual from rain earlier in the week. She stood on the bridge and looked at the sign bolted to the east railing, installed by the town council at a small ceremony she had attended without making a speech. Nora's Bridge, because one voice was enough. She stood there for a while looking at the railing and at the creek below, and at the afternoon light moving through the trees on the bank. Then she took a brown paper bag from her jacket pocket. Inside, she had placed a small flashlight compact with a reliable beam, the kind that would work when you needed it in the dark. She folded the bag closed and set it on the railing in the spot where Abe had always left his. She tucked a folded piece of paper under the bag so the wind off the creek wouldn't take it before someone found it. The paper said in her handwriting, "For your books." No name, no instruction, no expectation of anything in return. Just the thing itself placed where someone who needed it might find it. She walked back toward Birch Lane in the late afternoon light, hands in her jacket pockets, the creek running behind her, the bridge holding steady under the weight of everything that crossed it.